Hello my quilting friends, my name is Leah Day, and in this video we are loading the Evolution Hoop hybrid frame, and we are loading it in rolling rail mode. So we have changed up the frame so that way this back rail rolls, and this changes the loading process completely. So the first step is to make sure your Evolution Hoop frame is in rolling rail mode. That means this back rail has the ability, when unlocked, to roll. So change up your hardware. There is another video on that if you need a refresher on how to change your hardware out so that way that rail can become a rolling rail. And then now we're going to attach our backing fabric, and you can see I've already done this. I found the midpoint, I measured and found the midpoint of my frame, and I actually marked that on the back rail. So I aligned the midpoint of the backing fabric with the midpoint marked on the rail, and I placed a piece of tape. And I'm just using blue painter's tape here, guys. And so I've taped along the back edge. The instructions, this is the official instructions from Grace Company. I'll be honest, I don't particularly like using tape. I worry about residue on the rails, and I am going to be researching and playing with finding an alternative. But these are a wavy kind of effect on these rails, so I'm not sure what exactly is going to work. I've already tried Velcro and that didn't work. So for right now, I'm going to tape and just try and have an open mind. So the instructions also say to cut your backing fabric 20 inches bigger vertically on your quilt and 10 inches bigger than the quilt on the sides. I have not done that, so I'm crossing my fingers that this works, and if it doesn't, then I'll be like, well, I should have done what the instructions told me to do. So we know that 20 inches bigger sounds like a lot, but really the idea is, I think, the enough fabric to fully roll all the way around so that that tape is secured within. And I think that's the idea behind it. So it's up to you if you want to follow the instructions or, like me, try and see if you can get by with a little bit less backing fabric. We'll see. So I'm going to lock this rail down. We'll move to the front. I've done the exact same thing on the front. I measured, found the midpoint of the rail. I marked the rail with a Sharpie marker, folded the fabric in half, and then taped along. And we're going to roll this up and get it to bouncy tight. So this rail rolls forward, and as I roll it up, I'm smoothing it out, making sure that the edges of the fabric, which I ripped, are staying aligned. So that way I know that the quilt is not skewing to side. So there we go, smoothing it out, and I like about right there for how tight things should get. Really don't want it to be really locked down. Like if I was to clamp this down further than this, I might be adding too much tension to the quilt, which can, especially with the home sewing machine, result in thread breaks, needle breaks, and bad tension. So just watch out for that. This is bouncy tight. So with that backing fabric prepared, I'll grab my batting and smooth it in place. And you know, at this point, I can't really see the midpoint of my frame, but I can just visually eyeball this. Because this is such a small space, I don't really have to worry about this being perfectly centered, but that looks good. All right, now I'm gonna lock my channel lock. All right, so I have locked that down, and so now the machine can only roll side to side, and it's gonna roll straight. According to the frame, because what we've done is we've locked the machine on the carriage, and the carriage can now roll only side to side. So I'm going to roll it over here, and I'm just going to use my needle down, needle back up feature. Make sure to drop your foot. It is so easy to mess that up and accidentally start free motion quilting with your foot up, and you really want to watch out for that. And I just realized something else that I definitely need to do, and that is I need to change out this foot base. I've got an open toe foot that has two prongs that are facing this way. And as I travel over with my machine, guess what's going to happen? Those prongs are just going to get buried in my batting. So yeah, a little bit of a catastrophe there. So what I'm going to do is I am going to baste stitch across just using my needle up, needle down feature on my machine, and I'm going to baste stitch a straight line across. But first, I'm gonna go change out this foot base so that way I stop getting buried in my batting. So I stitched across to secure my batting to the backing, and I realized along the way that I'd forgotten to attach my side clamps. And this is something I definitely use now that I didn't use when I first started frame quilting. I just didn't understand why I needed to use them, and it took a few quilts to realize that I was getting a little struggle as I stitched side to side. It's like the backing wanted to kind of shrink inward. And I noticed that whenever I forget to attach my side clamps, that it becomes really obvious because as I'm stitching across, the quilt is kind of doing that number. So when I put that little bit of tension side to side, that completely stops. Now, smoothed out my quilt top. Again, I'm not really worried about it being perfectly, absolutely centered. I'm just getting it right in the middle of the batting and backing. That looks great. And now I'm just, again, using that needle up, needle down, and the channel lock. I've locked my channel lock so it's a nice straight line. And then as I needle down, needle back up, I'm just making sure that the printed design here, and this could also be a piecing line, this could be, you know, the edge of the quilt, whatever you're working with, right? But you just want to line up something straight with the edge of the foot or the needle. It's totally up to you. I tend to use a ruler foot these days all the time. So we've got our first stitching line lined up across, and now I smooth out all of those layers. So our quilt is ready to go, but you know, I really like to maximize my quilting space. And if I bring my machine back all the way, you can see I'm losing about 1/2 inch of quilting space here. My quilt really starts in the gray area. So I really want to kind of roll the whole quilt back a little bit. For that, I'm going to unlock this back rail and unlock the front rail. Those locks lift up real easy, and then I can just roll that hand wheel back just a little bit, tucking that fabric underneath the rail, and then make sure that I'm rolling it back to the point where I'm maximizing my quilting space. Now you can see here I'm beginning stitching right off of that gray line, the gray line meaning where my quilt panel begins, and then I can almost stitch down to the bottom of one of those green squares. I like that. So I'm going to lock both rails, making sure that I still have that nice bouncy tight kind of level, and then level of tension, and then I'm going to use my front clamps. And these are a little tight to start with, but as you use them, I think that they are going to soften up a little bit. Smooth out that quilt, make sure that it has nice and smooth, and then clamp that down. This is going to allow us to float that quilt across the front, just like so. There we go. So it's still bouncy tight, but nice and flat. I've not got any wrinkles in this. I've got good side tension from the side clamps, and I've got that perfect quilting area ready to go. Now you might be wondering about just how much space I have to quilt in on this machine. It is right at, looks like 6 inches. When I really look at that, these are 6-inch squares here on this printed panel. It's not a lot of space to play with, but I'm going to give you some tips in future videos on how to break a design down. So quilt half the block, then quilt the second half of the block, things like that. It's not a deal breaker, and this is a great place to start when it comes to home machine quilting on a frame. Okay, here, bonus guys. Yes, you do actually need to cut your backing fabric 20 inches longer than your quilt top. And here's why. There's just a lot of space between the rails on this frame. And if you go with the bigger long arm, you could have even more space between these rails. That creates an issue of the machine having a limit of how far forward you can pull it. Obviously, the back of the machine is going to bottom out on that back rail at some point. But when the fabric is taped to your front rail, there's a limit to how far forward you can pull the quilt. So right now the quilt is as rolled up as I can get it without ripping the tape off, but this is as far forward as I can pull the machine. And I have this section that basically is inaccessible. I can't reach it. I can't pull the quilt and I can't pull the machine. So the solution here, kind of what would have avoided this whole catastrophe, would have been having longer backing fabric. Super, super simple solution to a pretty big headache now. So I can honestly say this didn't save me any time. It didn't save me any fabric either. So learn from my mistake, cut your backing fabric 20 inches longer than your quilt top. So that is pretty much it for loading our hoop hybrid frame, our Evolution hybrid frame, whenever it's set up as a rolling rail frame. Now, one extra thing, I will baste a quilt, and that means that I roll my machine as far forward. When I'm standing at the front of the frame, I'll roll it as far forward as I can go, and I will run a line of basting stitches right along that line. Not only does that allow me to see how much space I have to quilt in, it also locks the layers of the quilt together. So if I'm working on something very, very special, that's pretty much a standard thing that I do now. It also really helps if you are quilting with pantos to stitch down the sides. So those are two extra things that I do a lot, but for the most part, if I'm doing something really quick, this is all I'll do. Stitch those 2 lines of quilting at the beginning, smooth everything out, clamp the front, clamp the sides, and we're ready to start quilting. So I hope that you have enjoyed learning from this video. If you'd like to learn how to load when your Evolution hoop frame is set up as a hoop frame, please check out my other videos. I will have a link below and you can click on that video, check it out, and see how you can quilt a big quilt on this frame too. You are not limited to just the size of the frame. That's only when it's set up as a rolling rail. You can quilt quilts of any size that you want when you have it set for hooping. So I hope that you have enjoyed this video. If you'd like to learn more about the Evolution Hoop Hybrid Frame, come and check it out, leahday.com/evolve. Until next time, let's go quilt.